my name is David McLaughlin, and I am the author of Voyage through the Bible. It's a 52-week study guide of the entire Bible. You can download it for free at voyagethroughthebible.com. You can also hear myself and Michael Willis teaching through that 52-week study guide as a podcast at voyageradio.org. If that's in focus, you'll be able to read it. What we're going to do is about a 5-minute voyage through the Bible. We're going to take you through a timeline that'll take you through the entire Bible. It's kind of small, but hopefully you can read it. The Bible is the story of the redemption of mankind. You have in that Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, sin, you have the fall of mankind, and the rest of the story of the Bible is how God redeemed mankind. John 3:16 tells us that for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish but have everlasting life. So this is how God decides to do this, how God is going to redeem mankind. He decides to create a nation called Israel. And that's really what the Old Testament story is. It's the history of the nation of Israel. God picks a man, his name is Abraham, that he's going to create the nation of Israel through. Now, we're going to draw a timeline that is the history of Israel. That timeline basically looks like this. If you can draw this, you're off to a great start on understanding Israel. God creates Abraham, and he creates this nation. And the nation starts off in a period called the patriarchal period. The patriarchs. The patriarchs were Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth. Jacob's name is actually changed to Israel. Israel, or Jacob, has 12 sons. Those become the 12 tribes of Israel, and all those descendants become the nation of Israel. And this is their history, a timeline of their history. Now, they have no king in the beginning. God is their king, and that's called a theocracy. Hold my board still. That's called a theocracy. Now, as time goes on, they start saying, we want a king, because all of the other nations had a king. So they get a king, and they become a monarchy. Now, during this time frame here, they have 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. And that's called the Golden Age of Israel. Now, at the end of Solomon's reign, the nation splits into 2. This is the history of Israel. At the end of Solomon's reign, the nation splits into 2 nations. You have the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, and the southern kingdom. My writing's horrible, by the way. You have the southern kingdom called Judah. By the way, this is where you get the term Jew, from Judah. Now, the northern kingdom of Israel, all of their kings were evil. They turned away from God. As a judgment against the northern kingdom of Israel, the Assyrians come in, and you have to be careful when you abbreviate Assyrians, by the way. The Assyrians come in as judgment and destroy the kingdom of Israel. The Israelites are taken in to Assyrian culture. They're taken into captivity, and they just assimilate into Assyrian culture. They're often called the lost 10 tribes of Israel, but they're not really lost. We know what happened to them. They just assimilate into Assyrian culture. Now, in the meantime, the Babylonians conquer the Assyrians. But before they do, the Assyrians try to conquer the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, Judah, most of their kings were bad as well, but a few of them were good. So they last a little longer than Israel does. But the Babylonians end up conquering the Assyrians. And then finally, because Judah turns away from God, the Babylonians, God allows them to conquer Judah in judgment against them for turning away from God. Now, Jerusalem is in Judah, and the temple is in Jerusalem. When the Babylonians conquer Judah, Jerusalem is destroyed and the temple is destroyed. The Jews are taken into Babylonian captivity for 70 years. So the Jews are taken into Babylonian captivity for 70 years. In the meantime, the Persians conquer the Babylonians. At the end of the 70 years, Persia's now in charge. King Cyrus of Persia allows the Jews to go back, at least a remnant of them, to go back and rebuild their temple, which they do. So they go back, rebuild their temple, And that's the end of the Old Testament. I'd like to point out a couple things here. From this point forward, the Jews are no longer a sovereign nation. They're in their land, but they're no longer sovereign over their own land. They're under foreign control. The Babylonians are in control, the Persians are in control. Now, this is the end of the Old Testament. If you're reading the Old Testament, you might be tempted to think you can start at Genesis and read through Malachi, and it just tells the chronological story, but it doesn't. What you have is the first section of the books are the books of the law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And that takes you through about this much of the story. Then you have the books of history, and that takes you through the rest of the story, the books of history. Then you have the books of poetry: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. They're mainly written, the books of poetry are written during this time period here. The book of Job is written about a time period back during this period. But then you have the books of prophecy. Now these books, the books of prophecy in the Old Testament, go back and tell this story again, except through the eyes of the prophets. What were the prophets saying during this time? So you go through the first part of the Old Testament and it tells the story. Then you have a little break in the books of prophecy, or in the books of poetry. And then the books of prophecy go back and tell it again, but through the eyes of the prophets. What were the prophets saying? So that's the Old Testament. Now, in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, you have 400 years of silence. This is the New Testament over here. They call it 400 years of silence because there's no historical books that tell what happened during this time in the Bible. But it's not totally silent biblically because the Old Testament prophets tell what's going to happen during the time. Daniel in particularly tells what's going to happen. And what happens is the Greeks conquer the Persians, and then the Romans conquer the Greeks during this 400-year time period in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So, when you close the Old Testament, the Persians are in control of the area where the Jews live. When you open the New Testament, the Romans are in control. It's in the same area, but the Romans are now in control. The New Testament, remember, all of this is a nation that the Messiah is going to come from. The New Testament tells the story of how the Messiah actually arrives. He comes from this nation of Israel. The Messiah, Jesus Christ, arrives, and that's what the New Testament is about. You have the Gospels that tell that Jesus came, and then you have the book of Acts that tells how the story of Jesus spreads. The disciples spread the gospel about Jesus. And then you have the epistles, which are letters that tell about Jesus and the things he did and doctrine and so forth, how the history of the church spreads, and that's the epistles. And then finally you have the book of Revelation, which, depending on your interpretation of the book of Revelation, tells you either about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70 or about a final future Antichrist and so forth of things to come. All views of Revelation end up telling about a final new heavens and new earth where this paradise lost in the Garden of Eden is finally restored in the new heavens and the new earth. That is the Bible. If you can understand the Old Testament, you can understand the entire thing. Again, the quickest thing to understand is this simple part of this timeline. This is what I want you to understand, and you can do it and explain it to other people. And I'll draw it inside this little empty area here. If you can draw this part and understand that, you too can understand the entire history of what happens in the Bible, and hopefully that will make more sense for you. You can learn more about the Bible and study more. VoyageThroughTheBible.com. You can download the Voyage Through the Bible Study Guide. We'll take you through the entire Bible in 52 weeks, just one lesson a week. You can listen to us teaching those lessons at voyageradio.org. You can download free podcasts of myself and Michael Willis teaching through those lessons. Hope you enjoy it.